In 1977, 87-year-old William McKinley stepped off a plane onto a rock-strewn island in the high Canadian Arctic. This grandfather from Glasgow, Scotland, had bitter memories of this forgotten land. Memories that traced back to 1913, when he joined an expedition that seemed cursed from the start. The Canadian Arctic Expedition of 1913 was conceived by a brilliant and ambitious anthropologist, Vilhjalmur Stefansson. At age 27, he'd headed into the wilds of northern Canada and spent 6 years living among the native Inuit tribes. He re-emerged in the spring of 1912, having reinvented himself as prophet and promoter of a newer, friendlier Arctic.
He managed to survive, and the thing is, when people saw him, they couldn't figure him out because he didn't look tough. He said, everyone has the Arctic wrong. This is his iconoclasm coming out in him. It's not hostile, it's not unforgiving, it is a friendly place.
Eager to build upon his success, the free-thinking Stefansson convinced the Canadian government to sponsor his next great adventure. An expedition to settle the question whether there might be an undiscovered continent hidden amidst the massive polar ice pack. The scope of the expedition grew as the Canadian government expanded its objectives. They decided to divide it into two teams. A land-based southern party, which would pursue scientific studies, and an ocean-bound exploratory northern party led by Stefansson himself that would search for new lands. Stefansson sent out telegrams all over the world, seeking to staff his enterprise. On a pleasant Glasgow evening in late April of 1913, William McKinley, then a 24-year-old mathematics and science teacher, received his invitation to become the project's magnetician.
He certainly had no idea what polar regions were like. The nearest he'd got to that was seeing a polar bear in Edinburgh Zoo. That was the nearest he'd got to the Arctic, you might say. But I think every little boy who was growing up in those days would be thinking not of becoming a train driver as they used to, but I'd love to be an Arctic explorer and become famous that way. It was their way up in the world, as it were.
McKinley, Wee Mac as his friends knew him, realized this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Within 3 days, he was on a steamer heading for North America, unaware that the expedition was already in a deadly race against time and the icy polar seas. Open waters surround the Arctic ice pack in summer, but with the chill of winter, the massive white wilderness can double in size, cutting off all passage northward until the spring thaw. Stefansson knew that in order to reach their first staging point, tiny Herschel Island, he would need to set sail by early June. This left only a few short months to prepare. The most pressing order of business was to find a suitable vessel that could take them safely into polar seas. With few choices available on such short notice, Stefansson quickly settled on the 24-year-old whaler Karluk, even though some questioned her suitability for the icy Arctic waters.
She was a square-rigged sailing ship with an auxiliary engine. Under power alone, she could do only 5 knots. With the help of sails, she could sometimes do 7. She was an old, underpowered, wooden ship.
Stefansson was not a mariner. To him, the Karluk was a good deal and as acceptable a ship as any. To the man hired to captain her, world-renowned seaman Captain Robert Abram Bartlett, the obsolete whaler was not only a disappointment, but a serious liability.
He condemned it, and in fact, anyone who got on board condemned it. Stephenson's position was, it's the only ship we've got to get going, otherwise, we'll lose a race here.
Despite their divergent opinions about the Carlock, Stephenson was pleased that Bartlett was to captain the voyage. The Newfoundland native had earned a reputation as an outstanding ice navigator, sailing with Robert Peary on his historic attainment of the North Pole in 1909. Unassuming in appearance and given to the use of profanity, Bartlett was also a lover of music and poetry.
Bartlett was a man with a tremendously romantic self-image. Bartlett envisioned himself as like Dr. Livingstone in Africa, except that this was going to be in the Arctic. A great leader, a great traveler, a great man generally, and he was sort of the last of the great Victorians.
Bartlett was not the only voice warning of trouble in the voyage. Stopping in Montreal to pick up his orders, McKinley heard critical murmurings about Stephenson from a member of the Canadian Meteorological Service.
He told me the reason I had been hired as a meteorologist as well as a magnetician was because no one in the Meteorological Service was willing to be associated with Stephenson's expedition. It was the first of many hints I was to receive as the weeks went by, that not everyone shared the faith in the suitability of Stephenson as an expedition leader.
When Wee Mac arrived in Victoria, British Columbia on June 1st of 1913, many of his fellow scientists were already there. But Stephenson, whom most had never met, was nowhere to be found, leaving the hasty provisioning of the ship to his subordinates.
They were concerned. They looked at the Carlock, for example, and to them it was a symbol of the mismanagement of the whole expedition. It had a grimy appearance. It was low in the water. It was filled with bales of equipment, and it just had a terrible appearance, amongst other things.
Stephenson arrived in British Columbia only 3 days before the scheduled departure, and with characteristic optimism, he posed for a publicity photo amidst the chaos of the Carlock's deck. His insensibility to the anxiety of his staff was underscored by his comments in private dispatches to Ottawa.
While every reasonable precaution will be taken to safeguard the lives of the party, it is realized by both the backer of the expedition and the members of it that even the lives of the party are secondary to accomplishment of the work.
On the 17th of June, already 1 week behind schedule, the Carlock made sail amidst much fanfare and anticipation.
We steamed round Esquimalt Harbour to cheers from the entire Canadian Pacific Fleet, line up on deck and filling the rigging. Good luck signals were hoisted, sirens wailed, and we were off in a glorious sunset.
As the Dominion government ship Carlock headed toward Alaska, the scientists and crewmen on board began to settle into the routine of shipboard life. They couldn't have known that nature and circumstance were conspiring against their journey's outcome. As the Canadian Arctic expedition began, the Carlock crawled along the contours of the rugged Alaskan coastline, heading toward Nome. There, on July 8, 1913, the northern party's Carlock and the two smaller schooners of the expedition's southern party anchored for a few days and hurriedly divided supplies and equipment amongst the three ships. Despite the lateness of the season, Wilhelm Stephenson still hoped both groups of his expedition would reach the Arctic shores before winter ice clogged vital waterways.
There's such a rush the whole time. There's so little planning that all the stores are divided haphazardly amongst the three ships. And so are the people. And everything was going to be fixed and organized when they got to Herschel Island. But Herschel Island would be difficult to get to the later in the season it was, and there was so much time being wasted because things had not been planned that their departure was getting dangerously late.
On July 10th, the concerned scientists formally confronted Stephenson about the disorganized state of affairs. The veteran explorer bristled at this challenge to his authority. In turn, some members of the staff took to calling their commander His Lordship behind his back.
There was no sense of cohesion in a team starting up. Of course, in a ship, small, very small ship, with cramped conditions and damp and cold and everything like that, that kind of feeling starts festering very quickly.
It was already late in July when the Karluk finally headed up through the Bering Strait. As she slipped across the Arctic Circle, tensions on board temporarily eased. The water was ice-free, and Karluk's successful rendezvous with the other two ships of the southern party at Herschel Island seemed assured. 4 days later, a blizzard struck, early for the season by fully a month. By the following morning, on only the 2nd day of August, the second mate reported ice off the port bow. The delays had been costly, and now the expedition would have to contend with the onset of an early winter.
They then continued eastward until they got into heavy field ice, and Bartlett said, "Look, this ship simply can't take this kind of punishment. She isn't built for it, and we should turn around and go back to Alaska and put her in harbor for the winter." And Stephenson said, "No, we're going to go on."
So tedious was their progress that it took the Karluk almost 4 days to travel 20 miles to windswept Point Barrow, the northernmost settlement of North America. Here, Stephenson finally completed his provisioning, including the hiring of an Inuit family to help with the hunting and sewing of winter apparel. But the Karluk was still at the mercy of the encroaching ice pack, which seemed to thicken with each mile they advanced.
It's not a question of being hit by an iceberg like the Titanic. It's that this floating pack ice is always on the move. Suddenly leads open up and you see, oh, there's a way that a ship can go up. And if you've got a ship which is not equipped for ice breaking, you have to rely on that.
Bartlett tried to keep the ship tight to shore, but the overloaded Karluk had already grounded several times in the silty shallows. When a lead opened in the ice heading away from land, the captain cautiously followed it. It would prove to be a fateful decision. On August 13th, with the Karluk still coursing through the maze of water and whiteness, the temperature began to drop, reaching 17 degrees Fahrenheit. Fresh ice began to clog the water between floes, which a gentle snowfall soon cemented around the helpless vessel. The Karluk was inescapably trapped miles from shore, locked in the vice-like grip of a floating pan of ice.
Drop anchor, port side.
Neither Bartlett nor Stephenson viewed their situation as grave. They knew that a change in the weather could just as instantly set them free again. For Arctic greenhorn William McKinley, the unplanned stop was an opportunity to realize a boyhood dream and finally set foot on the polar ice pack.
The ice was much broken up and rough, with scarcely a level patch of any extent. It was like being in some gigantic sculpture's yard, stacked as far as the eye could see with glistening marble rocks cut in a million fantastic shapes. As people do when confronted with a great sculpture, I had the irresistible urge to touch as well as look. We left the ship and cavorted about on the ice for hours.
As the days drifted into weeks, the ice became more prison than playground. Both Bartlett and Stephenson privately concluded that the Karluk was likely to be trapped for the duration of winter. For the expedition leader, this was a particularly bitter blow.
Stephenson, for his part, was a man of activity. I mean, he had to be on the go all the time. He didn't like to sit around. And of course, there he sits in the Karluk, going nowhere. His northern expedition is literally frozen. So he has to do something.
By September 20th, after 5 weeks on the ice, Stephenson could no longer tolerate the inactivity. He loaded 2 sledges with supplies and ammunition, planning to lead a small expedition 20 miles across the ice to land. It was a choice that many would later view with suspicion.
He professed that he was going on a hunting expedition to hunt caribou in Alaska. But this is very doubtful, because he himself had said that the Alaska caribou were nearly extinct. He also took people with him that certainly weren't hunters. He took his own personal secretary, and he took 1 or 2 of the scientists.
Stephenson's hunting party managed to reach a small island connected by land ice to the shore just before a heavy gale swept through the area. When the weather cleared, they could no longer see the Karluk in the distance. The ice pan which had been holding her fast had broken away, carrying the imprisoned ship away with it. Stephenson headed back toward Point Barrow in hopes that he could intercept the drifting ship. By the time he reached the village, the Karluk had long since disappeared over the horizon, beyond the reach of any possible rescue.
These are the areas of ultimate inaccessibility, ultimate challenge. There are no airplanes, there are no radios.
So nobody ever went to look for the Karluk. Nobody ever did.
Frozen into a pan of ice nearly half a mile wide, the Karluk was at the mercy of a current that was rapidly carrying her out into the middle of the frozen Arctic Ocean. In September of 1913, now separated from their leader Wilhelm Stephenson, the members of the Canadian Arctic expedition were trapped aboard their ship, the Karluk, locked in the grip of a frozen Arctic Ocean. Around them, the polar ice pack stretched out endlessly in all directions, alive with the persistent movements of 1,000 opposing flows, and crashing together into mountain-like pressure ridges amidst a thundering, almost musical roar.
These mini mountains, maybe 100 feet high, of ice blocks jumbled together, so suddenly they would loosen, come tearing down like a tenement of a house, rolling down towards you all over the place. It was incredibly dangerous and incredibly beautiful as well.
Captain Robert Bartlett knew that the Karluk might not long withstand such crushing pressure on her hull. He began caching supplies on a nearby floe of old sea ice. Back in Ottawa, dispatches from Stephenson reached the Canadian government with news of the Karluk's loss. Once his detractors learned how the commander had come to be separated from his flagship, they criticized him bitterly. Even a Canadian Mountie cynically noted in one report that he had left just in time.
People condemned him that, he was a coward, he had skipped the ship. The evidence suggests, and the research I have done basically said he agonized about leaving the ship. He wasn't a coward. This is not in him to be a coward. He just wanted to keep going.
Stephenson left his scientific party and then proceeded on the kind of thing he wanted to do anyway, a lone expedition by dog sled and on foot among the Canadian Arctic islands.
The beleaguered commander headed northward to resume his original quest as the helpless Karluk continued her vagabond waltz, drifting as much as 20 miles a day. As the days grew shorter, Captain Bartlett realized that temperatures on the ice pack might soon drop to 40 degrees below zero. As a precaution, he had his men pile snow high around the hull of the Karluk to insulate their quarters. The castaways felt safe, at least for the time being. In mid-November, the sun slipped below the horizon to begin its winter hibernation. Weeks of endless night lay before them, underscoring their sense of alienation in this strange and hostile world.
The howling and barking of the dogs was the only break in the black, icy silence that surrounded us. As the days passed without hope of release, we turned more and more in on ourselves, ever more dependent on the warmth and comfort inside the ship, and increasingly aware of the imperfections and deficiencies of the Karluk.
They'd lived on the ice for over 4 months, growing familiar with its constantly changing humor. Then, just days after the Christmas of 1913, they heard a familiar sound that filled their hearts with dread. The ice had begun to shift and break, moving ever closer to the vessel. On Saturday, January 10th at 6:45 p.m., a loud noise rocked the ship.
The ice began raftering, as they call it. Big ice pans coming up on top of the ice that was there. And one of these ice pans punched a hole in the ship, just about at the waterline.
Within an hour, the hull has a longer gash in it. Water is pouring in. It lists to 20 degrees to one side. It's obvious now that the Karluk is about to go down.
For Bartlett, the moment of truth had arrived, and he gave the order he had dreaded these many weeks.
Going down! All hands, abandon ship! Abandon ship!
With her passengers safely discharged onto the ice, the captain remained below with his treasured gramophone to await the final moments.
Bartlett seems to have had a flair for the theatric. There he is, apparently. He's got a collection of roughly 200 records. The ship is going down. He starts playing them one by one and then throwing the finished records into the fire. And the last record he puts on just before she goes beneath the ice is Chopin's Funeral March.
The ship should go down with their flag flying if possible, so he raised the Canadian Navy's blue ensign to the mast and then stepped out on deck and listened to the strains of the funeral mass while the water closed in over the deck.
Bartlett had been unhappy with the choice of the Karluk from the start. But as her mast slipped below the ice, the captain was visibly moved by the loss of his charge. He pushed back his hood as a sign of respect and called out, "Goodbye, old girl."
So there they were left in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, in the middle of the Arctic night, with lots of supplies, but nothing but ice under their feet.
By morning, the lead had frozen over with young ice. No trace of the old whaler remained. Her passengers were now castaways in a frozen wasteland with no hope of rescue. On January the 12th, 1914, 25 former passengers of the Karluk awoke to the cold stare of an icy sea. Their ship lay 38 fathoms below them on the floor of the Arctic Ocean. 2 large shelters constructed of boxes and snow were now their only refuge from the deadly cold of Arctic winter. Although they were drifting almost 300 miles from the coast of Siberia, the castaways clung to a sliver of hope.
Just before the ship began to go down, they had spotted Wrangel Island. They'd spotted the peak in the middle. They reckoned if William McKinley managed to fix the position properly, of where they were, and land was within striking distance at least, then they had a chance.
Wrangel Island was at the least 60 miles away across the constantly shifting ice pack. Captain Robert Abram Bartlett dispatched his first mate, 21-year-old Sandy Anderson, and a small scouting party to try and reach its shores. 14 days later, a member of the scouting party stumbled back into camp with disturbing news. The island they had seen was not Wrangel, but tiny Herald Island. Even more disturbing was the report that the first mate had taken his group across a dangerous stretch of ice to reach it. Bartlett knew that Herald Island was little more than a rock, devoid of life-saving resources. In the days to come, he would send several search parties to look for the missing men. The youthful first mate and 3 others were never seen again. McKinley's fascination with the Arctic began to give way to bitterness at the loss of such well-intended men.
They were 4 young men with no grand ideas about exploring the Arctic or finding new land. Just 4 sailors trying to follow orders.
Tensions in Shipwreck Camp continued to mount. Some of the scientists decided to set out for land on their own, against Bartlett's fervent objections.
Bartlett does not want them to leave. He wants the party to stay together. In fact, that is his responsibility, to keep them together. The scientists, being scientists, feel that they are unto themselves in many ways. They look upon Bartlett as a mere captain, and therefore they feel they don't have to take orders from him.
The group set out with full provisions on man-drawn sledges, leaving a final epistle for Bartlett, absolving him of any responsibility for their actions. Over a week later, a scout from the Shipwreck Camp stumbled upon a trail littered with discarded mittens and supplies that led him to the wayward expedition. The wearying travel across the ice had proven too much for them.
He tried to persuade them to turn around because they were obviously close to exhaustion at this point. All 4 of them were. He didn't think they could live another day when he met them. But they wouldn't do it. They were going to keep on trying to reach the land. So they disappeared. They were never heard of again.
In spite of these desperate developments, Bartlett knew that time was running out for the rest of Shipwreck Camp. With the spring thaw on the way, the ice floe that had been their home for the past 6 months would not remain safe much longer. He instructed the castaways to begin loading the sledges. On February 24th, they struck camp and headed west into the frigid unknown in hopes of somehow reaching Wrangel Island. In constant danger of frostbite and snow blindness, they made slow but deliberate progress through the hummocks of ice and snow. Each night they constructed a makeshift igloo to protect them from the deadly cold. Each morning at first light, they moved on. At one point, they were stopped by an enormous pressure ridge, up to 100 feet high and miles long. Some of the exhausted men wanted to return to the relative safety of Shipwreck Camp. Bartlett could not contain his rage.
The skipper was speechless at first, and then he asked them just what they intended doing when they reached Shipwreck Camp. Their sheepish replies showed they hadn't thought so far ahead, and he raged at them for their folly in risking the loss of all they had achieved up to that point.
They said, if it hadn't been for Captain Bartlett, we all would have died right there. And undoubtedly that's true. Bartlett was a very determined man. Nothing would stop him, you know.
15 days and 80 arduous miles away from Shipwreck Camp, they finally reached what must have seemed a virtual paradise, the snow-covered beaches of Wrangel Island.
Luna! Land! It's land!
They got down and dug away the snow and picked up a few pebbles and so on to celebrate the fact that they'd reached land, or some kind of land. Now, Wrangel Island isn't the mainland of Siberia. It's a long way from the mainland of Siberia. But it's a lot better than being stranded out in the middle of the Arctic Ocean.
But Bartlett knew the island was only a temporary refuge. As the others set up camp, he prepared to leave with one of the Inuit men. Against all odds, he would attempt to cross ice and open water over 200 miles to Siberia. Only days after landing on the windswept island, William McKinley bade farewell to the man he had come to look upon not only as a friend, but as a great leader of men.
We said goodbye. They were off, with the hopes and prayers of 15 people speeding them on their long, lonely journey. On them depended any chance we had of leaving Wrangel Island alive.
With their leader gone, the castaways had only one mission: to survive until help arrived. They spread out over the island into 3 camps to ensure a wider hunting area, but game proved to be in short supply. Already tenuous relationships began to unravel under the strain of dwindling rations.
They had the most extraordinary rows about food in particular. And one of the rows was about whether certain people were getting 1/8 of a biscuit more than the others were. It shows the kind of pressures that are on you when you allow that. When you've got a well-stocked larder, you don't give a damn about 1/8 of a biscuit.
A mysterious illness swept through the camps, marked by a severe swelling of arms and legs. By late May, it had claimed the lives of 2 men. McKinley, now the sole surviving member of the scientific staff, had to wait for the ground to thaw before he could bury his 2 friends.
The remaining Inuit hunter and his wife were the people who really kept them going. About 80% or more of the meat they secured was secured by the Inuit.
By late summer, their food rations were depleted. The eggs of nesting gulls provided occasional sustenance, but the castaways suffered many hungry nights.
They had hoped that Captain Bartlett's rescue mission would arrive for them in the middle of July of 1914. That was the idea. But July passed, nobody. August passed, nobody.
Thursday, August 27th. That is our only thought in our waking moments. When will she come? Will she come? Is the captain lost? Only time will answer these. But God forbid that we should have to winter here. It's a hopeless proposition.
While the castaways languished on barren Wrangel Island, Captain Robert Bartlett and his Inuit companion were forging their way over treacherous moving ice in an attempt to reach help in Siberia.
They traveled over the running ice, making an average of 4 to 5 miles a day progress, never knowing when they were going to be completely stranded. This was the most dangerous ice journey ever made by human beings, I would say.
Bartlett reached the Russian port of Emma Harbor 2 months after leaving Wrangel Island, having traveled nearly 700 miles of ice and rugged Siberian coastline. In early May, when the winter ice finally began to clear from the Bering Strait, a worn and weary Bartlett sailed home aboard the whaler Herman. Bartlett's amazing feat won him instant worldwide attention, but the captain's only thoughts were of his crew. Over the next 3 months, aboard the U.S. revenue cutter Bear, he tried to reach his former shipmates back on Wrangel Island. But the ice proved unrelenting.
Because of the ice, it was impossible. A couple of ships tried during August, were turned back, and even a Russian ship was coming close. It turned back because war had been declared at that point, and they had other duties to perform.
The would-be rescuers were beginning to give up hope. Even the determined Bartlett wondered if he would ever see his comrades again. By early September, autumn's bite was in the air. If the hapless crew of the Karluk was not recovered soon, they would have little hope of surviving a winter on the island. Then, on a chill September afternoon, a tiny schooner, the King and Wing, did what so many others had failed to accomplish: dropped anchor off the shores of icebound Wrangel Island. Cameramen on board caught the first moments as the rescuers hurried across the ice toward the shipwrecked crew.
Their reactions were very odd. They didn't also start whooping and dancing with joy and rushing down to the shore to welcome their rescuers. They were terribly shy. They felt that this was another world coming to them. It didn't dawn on them really that they had been rescued until they were actually on the ship. They were astonished to find that they were the biggest news story in the world, because they'd been written off as dead.
On board the cutter Bear, Captain Bartlett noticed a small schooner approaching from the north. To the captain's great relief, he could see his shipmates on board. Now united once more with their captain, the castaway spirits rose with each mile that passed between them and their former island prison. Still flushed with his newfound freedom, William McKinley penned this letter home with welcome news for his worried family.
Just think of it, all of you. I am alive. And more than alive, I am living. None of you know what life is, nor will you know, until you come as near losing it as we were. Know that of 6 scientists aboard the Karluk, I alone remain, and will soon be among you to tell you a story the world has never heard.
All told, 11 men had died after the Karluk had slipped beneath the ice. Despite this tragic loss of life, the Canadian Arctic expedition was ultimately hailed as a success. The Southern Party returned home in 1916, having completed one of the most extensive ethnological and geological surveys of the area in and around Coronation Gulf. But what of Expedition Commander Wilhelm Stephenson? After abandoning the Karluk and after splitting with the Southern Party in March of 1914, he had forged onward into higher latitudes and hadn't been heard from since.
When he was presumed lost in the ice in 1914-15, you'll find individuals, the Geological Survey, saying essentially, don't send out a search expedition for Stephenson. His life is not worth it.
And he was given up for dead. But 5 years later he showed up, and sure enough, he had discovered the last 3 small islands that had not been mapped in the world.
Very much alive, Stephenson emerged from the Arctic in 1918, having claimed for Canada the islands of Brock, Borden, and Maine. He had covered over 100,000 square miles of new Arctic territory, failing to find any trace of a last great continent. In his account of the expedition, The Friendly Arctic, published in 1921, the Karluk tragedy was only mentioned as a footnote to his great adventure. he defended the loss of life against the backdrop of World War I.
I never could see how anyone can extol the sacrifice of 1 million lives for political progress, who condemns the sacrifice of 12 lives for scientific progress. For the advance of science is but the advance of truth, and the truth shall make you free.
The Carlock's former captain, Robert Bartlett, was honored by the Royal Geographic Society for his leadership. Yet many others blamed him for the loss of life. After all, it had been his decision to take the Carlock away from the relative safety of the shore and into the thick of the ice pack. But William McKinley never forgot the man to whom he felt he owed his life.
Bartlett was a hero to McKinley. I think he's a hero to everybody else. Bartlett is the one truly heroic figure who emerges from that ill-fated expedition.
Bartlett went on to lead 17 more expeditions into Arctic waters, never again losing a life under his command. After fighting in the trenches of World War I, McKinley married and settled down to resume the quiet life of a teacher. Yet, years later, he remained haunted by the ordeal on the ice and embittered by Stephenson's seeming lack of remorse. At the age of 86, he finally published his own account of the events that had shaped his youth. Defending Captain Bartlett, he placed full blame for the tragedy on Stephenson's lack of planning and leadership, as he explained in a 1988 interview.
He was the great man, and he wasn't worried about details. What would you say about a man who leaves his ship? Would you say he'd let the members of his expedition down, he'd quit it? The lives that were lost with the Carlock were lost by errors for which the skipper had absolutely no responsibility.
Perhaps McKinley was able to close this chapter of his life when he returned to the Arctic in 1977. But for some, his book only served to rekindle a debate which, to this date, historians cannot settle.
I don't know how it could have been different. Choices were made. Options, they had options. So if you have a villain in this, the villain, to me, is the ice.
I think it's a bit pointless to say Stephenson was a scoundrel. I'd rather think that he was flawed and misguided, but that there was a kind of greatness inside him, waiting to come out, but it came out in the wrong way. With the Carlock, everything was left to chance, and chance let them down.
It has long been the conceit of man, gazing with the blind eye of pride, to view himself as master of surf and sand. The frozen remains of the Carlock, lost somewhere beneath 38 fathoms of Arctic sea, serve as one more reminder of the folly of such arrogance in the pursuit of glory.